I'm Carl Schramm. I'm president of the Kauffman Foundation in Kansas City. The Kauffman Foundation is dedicated to entrepreneurship, to helping entrepreneurs get new businesses started. But in addition, we're the largest private funder of economic research in the country. Now, why this is important is, as you all know, the American economy is in a dead stop. And from the president on down, people are puzzling as to what to do. Most of what we've tried, the stimulus, for example, just doesn't seem to be working. There aren't shovel-ready jobs. We have a sense that somehow consumers will restart the economy, but they haven't done it yet. And in fact, as we talk today, it looks as if around the world, particularly in Europe, we're watching other countries fall further into slow growth or no growth. We call this a recession, and we're all hoping it's not going to turn into something worse globally. Now, happily, at the Kauffman Foundation, we've been working for a long time on the theory of entrepreneurship. And the good news seems to be that if there's one sure way to start the economy, it's to turn to entrepreneurs in the creation of new businesses. And we know this for sure, and I'll show you in a minute, because when we study how previous recessions have been resolved, it's been, in fact, an uptick in the activity of entrepreneurs that have restarted the economies. So simply put, at Kauffman, we like to think about the current situation as more entrepreneurs equals recovery, or entrepreneurship is the key to getting our nation's economy restarted. Entrepreneurs have been critical to firing our growth. And if we look at growth around the world, it turns out that the strongest predictor of a country's growth rate is the number of new businesses that get founded in each country every year. Now come over here and we're going to look at what this means in terms of growth. And simply, what it really boils down to, as we know, is jobs. Who's working and who's not. And in some ways, the single most important economic number that households worry about is who's got jobs. Characteristic of this recession and all recessions is when these recessions hit, people are laid off. Simply, not speaking as an economist, but simply someone who puzzles this thing through, when you think about contractions or recessions, they aren't some great mystery. They really are lots of firms getting smaller. The demand for their products or services is decreasing, so they need fewer people to work for them. The firms get smaller. And when we have an expansion happen, a recovery happen, not only do firms hire people back, but more firms hire more people. Now, it's these new firms that have been critical over the long history of American economic progress. And this chart shows us the importance of new firms to job creation. All the jobs created in the United States year after year are in firms that are less than 5 years old. And if we think about this, big firms are in the business of putting people out of work. They want to become more efficient. They have lots of money, so they can substitute machines for people. And in fact, stockholders like to see firms get smaller in terms of headcount because it means they're becoming more efficient or more productive. It's the new firms that are essentially just people that are critical to firing the economy. And if we look at this long period of time from 1977 to the last year for which we have data, which is 2005, we see consistently that it is the green bars, these are the new firms adding new jobs. And when you have an expansion, not only to new firms, the green bars go up, but also the existing firms hire people back. Now, when we go into recessions, you can see that we in fact become losers of jobs. And these jobs are largely lost from big firms. See how small the blue lines are? But see, the startup firms, these green lines, continue to be high. And in fact, as they remain high, as the new firms keep hiring people, in fact, we restart the economy. And if you want to see something that's really marvelous here, look at how consistent that green set of bars is throughout this whole very long period of 2 decades plus. in terms of job creation in the United States. These are the firms, less than 5 years old, that are creating and adding new jobs. And without them, look where our job creation would be. There's something very, very interesting, something that most economists know nothing about, in terms of why new firms are important to job creation. New firms largely don't pay attention to the ups and downs of the business cycle. In fact, if we look at the creation of new firms, it's relatively steady through time. It's actually one of the most extraordinary idiosyncrasies in all of economics, that new firms, largely driven by entrepreneurs, who are largely driven by new ideas, seem to be impervious to business cycles. Ideas just keep tumbling in. And if we think about new firms as the incarnation or the concrete formation of new ideas, they're pretty consistent through time. And in fact, we follow over this very long period, 30 or 40 years, our new firms in the United States consistently create at least 3 million new jobs every year. This is very critical because the United States economy is different from most other economies in the world. We have to add about 3 million new jobs just to keep the population at full employment. But something's different right here, and I'm going to draw this in red, and we're going to call this right here 2009. And in 2009, we are watching our new firms, still about the same numbers. We have about 600,000 to 700,000 new firms a year. But starting in 2009, they've been creating fewer jobs. The average firm has been creating about 7 jobs a year. But starting here, we're starting to watch new firms, while the number stays pretty consistent, create less than 5 jobs per firm. So that between the year 2009 and 2019, we will watch at least 7.5 million fewer jobs created in America. This is very serious. Without those jobs, we won't have growth. And without those jobs, we're going to be looking at a chronic unemployment rate of somewhere between 9 and 10%. This is a reality that Americans are not used to. We are used to thinking about having a brighter world for our kids. So it's very important that we concentrate on these data. It's very important that we think hard about entrepreneurship as the source of recovery. And it's critical that we focus on what it is we can do to encourage more entrepreneurs to start firms and create jobs and create new innovative products. At the Kauffman Foundation, we've proposed recently the framework of general legislation in Washington, which we call the Startup Act. How can the government make it easier for these entrepreneurs to start their businesses and look forward to a brighter future such that they in fact return to hiring more people even in the first and second years of their business? It's important that Washington sends signals to these folks that starting businesses is critical to our recovery. Now our next speaker is Bob Litan. And Bob is the director of all the research here at the Kauffman Foundation. And Bob will now conduct you through what we think the government ought to do, largely to get out of the way, to encourage these folks with tax policy and whatnot, to get these businesses started.
We at Kauffman believe that it's now more important than ever to begin a national conversation about how to reinvigorate the startup engine that has historically powered the U.S. economy. But given the tight budgets at the federal and state governments, it's vital that whatever steps we as a nation take cost as little as possible and ideally nothing to taxpayers. And so what we here at the Foundation have tried to do is identify a set of policies that will in fact restart America and restart that startup engine. We've identified 4 particular areas of reforms. Now, these ideas are not new, or at least most of them aren't. They've been in the public domain. They've been debated. There is bipartisan support for many of these ideas. But what is new is that we have now attempted to package these range of ideas into something called the Startup Act that collectively could help re-jumpstart the U.S. economy by revving up that startup engine. Let's go to these ideas now. Number one, let's welcome more new founders of new businesses to the United States. It's a fact that immigrants found businesses at higher rates than Native Americans. And if you look to high-tech businesses in particular, you'll see that between 1995 and 2005, that immigrants have founded fully 1/4 of these successful high-tech businesses. These businesses collectively account for $52 billion of sales in America a year. And even more important, they have created 450,000 jobs for Americans that did not exist before. And this is an important fact. When immigrants found new businesses, they do not take jobs from any Americans. They create jobs for Americans. So given that fact, why isn't it common sense to let's import more immigrant founders to the United States? And there's a simple way to do so. Let's give temporary visas to immigrants who come here and found businesses. Let's extend those visas if they hire at least one non-family member. And if after 5 years they've hired, let's say, a minimum number of, let's say, 5 Americans, let's give them permanent green card status in the United States. There are already 1 million workers here in the United States on temporary H-1B visas. If we don't change the law, these workers are going to be sent back home, even though they're highly trained, and even though many of them could form those new businesses that could recreate a lot more jobs than the jobs that have already been created. So let's change the laws and allow new immigrants to form businesses and stay here in the United States. Let's go to the second area of reform. It's important for any new business, whether they're starting or whether they're in their growth phase, to be able to attract the capital they need to expand their business. We think modest changes in the tax law could help attract outside investment and boost the rate of formation and growth of these scale firms. First thing is, let's say that capital gains are no longer taxed for investments that are held for at least 5 years. So if an angel investor or a friend or a family puts money into a new business, let's not put a capital gains tax if they hold that investment for 5 years. This attracts the kind of patient capital that new firms need to grow. Second, once those firms become profitable, let's have lower taxes, or ideally no taxes, for the first year or two in which they're profitable. Maybe no tax in the first year, maybe 50% tax in the second year, 50% of what they would otherwise pay. And then after the third year, let them pay taxes like all other companies. This would allow new businesses to keep more cash at home, to be able to expand their businesses and employ more workers and grow their businesses to support what they've started. And finally, a lot of businesses reach the point where they're ready to go public and access the public markets and get support and capital from outside investors. But when they do that, they have to comply with a raft of rules. One set of those rules was enacted in 2002 after the accounting scandals of that period, called Sarbanes-Oxley, or SOX for short. There's a provision of Sarbanes-Oxley that has turned out to be a lot more onerous than anyone ever expected. It's called Section 404, and it relates to the internal controls that companies have to manage their cash and make sure they're not wasting money or committing fraud. This provision, this auditing provision, has turned out to be a lot more expensive, $1 million or more, which may be a drop in the bucket for big companies, but for small companies, it can make such a difference that it can cost as much as $20 million in market capitalization to these new small companies. So let's have a very sensible reform. Let's say that for new companies, when they go public, why not give the shareholders the option to decide whether or not the new company is Sarbanes-Oxley compliant? If the shareholders believe this will help attract the new capital to comply, fine. If they don't think so, then Sarbanes-Oxley should not be complied with. There ought to be an opt-out right when it comes to Sarbanes-Oxley compliance. Number 3, new firms are important not only because they create jobs, but because they accelerate the commercialization of new technologies. If you look over the course of American history and think about the things that have made America what it is today, a modern society, things like the telephone, the telegraph, the automobile, the railroad, computers, all the kinds of internet companies that we have, air conditioning, which has essentially made population go to the south. All those technologies were invented by entrepreneurs, not by existing businesses. And so if we want to keep that flow of new technology coming into the marketplace, we've got to make a couple of reforms. One simple idea is that right now we have a backlog at the Patent Office of 700,000 applications that haven't been decided on because there are just simply too many of them and not enough patent examiners to go around. And there's not enough money to keep on hiring patent examiners, but what we can do is charge more money to the people who apply and want a quick decision, and let the price system ration out the applications. Higher fees for people that want quick decisions. And for small business and for individuals who don't have those high fees, let's have a different schedule for them. They would still pay more if they want a quick decision, but they wouldn't pay as much as larger companies. So that's a simple solution to the patent problem. There is a second problem that's plaguing commercialization in America, and relates to the fact that the federal government now spends $30 billion a year on funding academic research. That money is supposed to not only support new ideas, but support the translation of those ideas into the marketplace with new products and new services. We think this process is broken, and it's no more apparent than the area of life sciences. Right now, a lot of this $30 billion goes to the National Institute of Health. And over time, the funding for NIH has gone straight up. But you would think with all that money pouring into NIH that we'd have more drug approvals over time. But you'd be wrong. In fact, over time, the rate of drug approvals has declined. So the productivity of our research effort is flagging. Now, part of this may be due to the fact that it's more expensive to develop new drugs. We're pushing against the envelope, if you will. But there's another reason we think, based on the research that we funded and conducted here at Kauffman, that we've seen declining productivity of this $30 billion. And that is due to the fact that academic inventors are facing monopolies in their own universities. They don't have a choice. They can't go to their own lawyer or their own licensing agent. They have to use the university as the licensing agent for their new technologies. This is totally aberrational. Universities do not require a single office to approve new publications. We don't have single licensing agents in other parts of the economy. So let's have a simple rule that simply says that faculty can choose their own licensing agent, and the federal government can speed this along because it can leverage the fact that it's spending $30 billion, and it can say to universities, if you want our federal money, you have to give your academics the choice or the ability to choose their own licensing agent. Faster commercialization will lead to more money for universities. It will lead to better and faster products for American consumers, and it will lead to a better world and more jobs at a faster pace for Americans. Finally, all businesses have to comply with a raft of rules, whether they come from the federal government or they come from states and localities. We think there are 3 simple ideas that can help new and existing businesses cope with all these rules. At the federal level, let's adopt something called a sunset requirement so that after 10 years, all rules that are on the books go away. And the reason we think this should be done is that the world is changing all the time, and the cost-benefit balancing that went into setting these rules very possibly has changed in the last 10 years, given all the technology that is racing ahead. And one way to accommodate that is to sunset after 10 years these rules. But second, let's say that all the new rules that are passed have to pass a benefit cost test. And in particular, the benefits have to be greater than the costs. You would think this common sense rule is now on the books, and it is for some statutes. But for most statutes, that is not the case. let's adopt a universal rule that says all new rules have to pass a benefit cost test. And finally, a lot of the rules that businesses have to comply with are set by states and localities. So here's something the federal government could do. It could fund research to enable the private sector to rank the various states on their friendliness to starting new businesses. So wouldn't it be wonderful to have states around the country trying to compete for being the #1 friendly state or locality for starting new business? We would have a virtuous cycle in competition. Now, this is not a new idea. We now do this at the global level. The World Bank, for the last several years, has been issuing something called the Doing Business Report, which ranks countries on their friendliness to starting new business, and countries have been racing to the top in trying to facilitate and foster the formation of new business by getting rid of unnecessary rules. Let's adopt the same principle and apply that same competitive principle here at home in the United States. And so there it is. These are the 4 components of what we have called the Startup Act, which we think is necessary to help reinvigorate the startup engine that will in turn reinvigorate the American economy. At the same time, we hope it will induce you, our viewers, to think of your own ideas, to communicate them to our policymakers in Washington, and have our policymakers also contribute their ideas as to how they think they can get the startup engine revved up again so that America can get revved up again.